There's an immense force pushing back the tide of climate action. With each blockade stymied by private police, green policy measures blocked by upstart politicians, or global talks crumbling at the hands of deceptive negotiators, comes yet more disappointment and dread as we inch ever upwards in global temperatures. And behind these setbacks lie the corporate behemoths of the fossil fuel industry. A dense web of PR, lobbyists, think tanks, nonprofits, and the corporations themselves have worked tirelessly to not only hinder any action that might bring us closer to a more sustainable world, but also ingrain a fossil fuel ideology that venerates oil and gas as both a national and global necessity. Today we unravel this web. A web of corporate power that reveals the immense reach and influence of fossil capital. One that connects the halls of university to the bowels of a natural gas rig, executive boardrooms to riot police, and this guy to rampant emissions. This video is better on Nebula. Use the link in the description below or stick around until the end to find out how you can support our changing climate directly by signing up for Nebula. There you can watch this video ad-free and also watch over 25 OCC videos that I haven't released on YouTube, including my most recent Nebula Plus video investigating just how much oil and gas companies are investing in fossil fuel infrastructure. To be a diplomat for Saudi Arabia at the annual UN climate negotiations is to be a skilled manipulator. For over 2 decades, oil-rich Saudi Arabia, which sources almost 50% of state revenue from its oil subsidiary Saudi Aramco, has been hard at work blocking any climate progress on the world's largest stage. Through relentless delay tactics like adding poison words to climate agreements to make sure negotiations fail, to watering down the language of IPCC reports, Saudi climate delegates have developed an ongoing slew of tactics to stymie climate action since the 1990s when talks began. Indeed, a paper from the Climate Social Science Network did a deep dive into how Saudi Arabia slows climate progress at UN climate negotiations and found that it sees its national interest as best served by obstructing intergovernmental efforts to tackle climate change rather than engaging with those efforts. This seems to be the primary mission statement of fossil capital broadly, one that Saudi Arabia reveals very clearly through their climate negotiations, but is also mirrored by countless oil and gas multinationals. Because the world of fossil fuels is one of obfuscation and obstruction. Fossil fuel corporations, whether state-owned like Saudi Aramco or publicly traded multinationals like ExxonMobil or BP, have one goal: protect their profits and continue the treadmill of capital accumulation. And they do that through unfeathered fossil fuel extraction and production. But it's never as simple, or perhaps as obvious, as the decades of meddling perpetrated by Saudi Arabia at climate talks. As climate scientist James Hansen notes, corporate climate denial has transformed within the last decade as the science has become increasingly more clear and damning. Eschewing flat-out denial that climate change exists, fossil capital's obstruction has split off into a diversity of tactics like the head of a hydra. From delay to division to downplaying to deflection, the denial apparatus of fossil fuel corporations uses sleight of hand and gaslighting to pervade our lives in subtle ways and break down any meaningful climate progress. BP's popularization of the carbon footprint during its 2006 media campaign is a quintessential example of the corporate tactic of deflection, a tactic that moves the burden of climate change away from fossil capital and towards the people.
What size is your carbon footprint?
This individualization of a systemic problem with roots in the capitalist mode of production and extraction is an insidious poison to movement building. Moving the goalpost of climate action from one of abolishing fossil fuel production to one of encouraging individuals to change their eating or driving habits is a great way to silo movements and slow down action. Part of the reason why this tactic is so powerful is that it makes a lot of sense on the surface. Not using any fossil fuels sounds amazing, and that is the end goal. But it is essentially impossible for most people because we live in a world soaked in those fuels. Our economy still exists within a framework of fossil fuel production. We don't really have an alternative. And the fossil fuel industry loves to point this out in commercials.
Because oil and gas are part of just about everything you touch.
Fossil fuels are inescapable in our daily lives. So if we believe that the only way to act is by turning off the heat, minimizing our footprint, or going zero waste, we will not only struggle with those difficult tasks, but will also have very little energy to address the real culprit of the climate crisis through policy and political action. As Naomi Klein notes in an interview,
if you can't be an activist unless you have already somehow purged your whole life of fossil fuels, then you'll have a movement of 3 people, which is great for the fossil fuel companies.
So not only does the fossil fuel industry push their products into every corner of our lives, but they then turn around and try to blame us for the crisis they've caused through things like carbon footprint calculators. This is essentially victim blaming on a mass scale. We see this in ExxonMobil's decades of advertorial campaigns in the New York Times, which, as one research paper notes, downplays the reality and seriousness of climate change, normalizes fossil fuel lock-in, and individualizes responsibility. Or the consistent lambasting of activists in the media.
Gail Bradbrook, one of the leading Extinction Rebellion drivers, that she drives a diesel car and buys imported food wrapped in non-recyclable packaging.
This deflection tactic has invaded climate spaces so thoroughly that it has begun to break apart possible coalitions. For me at least, I feel climate guilt and shame around taking a flight or not being 100% vegan, and that shame can sometimes make me feel that I'm not up to the task of actually joining the fight to bring down fossil fuels. Individualizing the problem of fossil fuel production allows the fossil fuel industry to get away with planetary ecocide. And while they're doing that, we squabble among ourselves about how many days a week we should be driving. As climate scientist James Hansen notes, fossil fuel corporations want people disengaged on the sidelines rather than on the front lines. This means countless articles listing the top things we as individuals should be doing to save the environment, or campaigns based on guilt and shame which ostracize many would-be activists from joining the fight. The cumulative effect of all this messaging is that we feel like we have to somehow rid ourselves of fossil fuel consumption before we start the task of abolishing fossil fuels and scaling up viable alternatives. And in this process, we expend precious emotional and mental energy fighting among ourselves and with ourselves. All the while, fossil fuel extraction continues on unabated. Of course, when activists and movements do manage to wrestle off the yoke of consumption blaming and begin to pressure the infrastructure and profits of fossil capital, fossil-fueled corporations have several tactics to fight back. For the last 3 decades, downplaying the science and the extent of climate change has been an industry favorite. Corporate interests have worked hard to erode the surety of the climate crisis through its avatars like Saudi Arabia's negotiators meddling in IPCC reports, or more broadly with fossil fuel-backed scientists that twist models and studies to service fossil capital. Nowhere is this more evident than with ExxonMobil developing climate models in the 1970s that accurately predicted warming trends, only for the company to bury the findings and embark on an extensive campaign of climate disinformation that downplayed the extent of climate change and the culpability of the fossil fuel industry. In documents uncovered by Neela Banerjee and fellow reporters at Inside Climate News, alongside Amy Westervelt at Drilled and Christopher Matthews at The Wall Street Journal, we can see that ExxonMobil internally worked to develop strategies to water down the scientific consensus that climate change was a looming crisis caused by fossil fuel extraction. As Banerjee explains in an interview with Frontline,
Exxon was on the cutting edge of science. They wanted to be on the cutting edge of science 40 years ago on climate change. And they ended up instead leading the denial and clouding of public perceptions of science.
For decades, the forces of fossil capital spearheaded by ExxonMobil poured money into nonprofits, think tanks, and academic researchers like Professor Patrick Michaels.
I would like to show you the warming that the satellites sensed over the same region from 1979 to now. Nothing.
With funding from fossil capitalists, Michaels wrote numerous op-eds and papers throwing doubt on the science of climate change throughout the 1990s and 2000s. And this downplaying continues today with the likes of political scientist Bjorn Lomborg.
This ignores that much of the data is actually more encouraging than expected.
Through his speeches and papers, Lomborg consistently downplays the seriousness of the climate crisis, all the while raking in millions from fossil capitalists through his think tank. And this downplaying is often accompanied by one of the more pernicious approaches to corporate obstructionism: delay. Now that climate policy and talks have made it to front of mind for billions across the world, and as nations begin to build up climate agendas that actually start slashing fossil fuel emissions, fossil capitalists have looked towards delay tactics to shield them from the blow of climate action. Chief among these delay tactics is an overwhelming emphasis on carbon capture and storage. At a climate tech conference, journalist Molly Taft writes that fossil fuel funders were taking an interest not in near-term technologies that could replace or knock out their product, like solar or EVs, but in longer-term ideas that will take a lot of research and capital, and give them room to keep producing as much oil as possible in the next decade. Carbon capture and storage fits this description perfectly. Fossil fuel multinationals champion these unproven technologies because they know what many environmentalists already know. If they can move the goalpost to scale up untested carbon capture in the future, fossil fuel corporations can continue to extract and sell copious amounts of fossil fuels in the present. Essentially, fossil capital's mouthpieces claim that it doesn't need to change anything now because 20 years down the line, some savior technology will suck up all of their cumulative emissions. Hand in hand with carbon capture and storage, the fossil fuel industry has increasingly hidden behind carbon offsets, a new form of colonialism and imperialism. A broken system that allows pollution to run rampant while across the world communities are evicted from their land in the name of preservation. Instead of cleaning up their mess, fossil fuel corporations, as scholar Larry Lohman writes, open yet another field of appropriation to clean it up. To be clear, carbon offsets, especially when it's just preserving a forest that has already been preserved, are useless on an industrial scale. It rewards fossil fuel corporations for protecting a forest that often has already been stewarded and cared for by surrounding communities for generations. Net zero carbon offsets and carbon storage only just delay the necessary dismantling of oil and gas production, leaving us with little reward in return. When the climate movement gets a little too close to disrupting the endless cycle of climate accumulation enjoyed by the fossil fuel elite, however, they resort to criminalization and state violence. We saw this in the state response to the Dakota Access Pipeline and Keystone XL blockades. In the fallout of those actions, the FBI ramped up its surveillance of young indigenous activists, labeling them eco-terrorists. This kind of surveillance has been happening for decades. According to a report from Grist and Type Investigations, long before Keystone and Dakota Access Pipelines became national flashpoints, the federal government was already developing a sweeping law enforcement strategy to counter any acts of civil disobedience aimed at preventing fossil fuel extraction. Indeed, this state-backed surveillance and policing of climate protest has been at work since the 1990s, when activists from the Earth Liberation Front and Animal Liberation Front were hounded by the FBI and deemed terrorists. This era was deemed the Green Scare, as ecoterrorism became the #1 domestic terror threat in the eyes of the FBI, a sentiment that seems to be increasingly institutionalized as fossil capital influences state governments and laws to criminalize climate protests throughout the United States. And when those laws fail to protect pipelines and refineries, fossil fuel corporations take matters into their own hands, directly paying and outfitting cops, like in the case of Enbridge funneling $8.9 million to Minnesota law enforcement agencies to protect the construction of a Line 3 pipeline from protesters. But it's not just the US that's weathering this storm of fossil capitalist policing. Across the world, fossil capitalist states are mobilizing law enforcement to protect extraction and production infrastructure, and ultimately their profits. In the UK, members of parliament introduced a public order bill which would hand the police power to stop and search protesters, as well as create 6-month jail sentences for protesters who lock themselves to infrastructure. While in Brazil, the state under Bolsonaro murdered rainforest protectors and environmental activists. So as the climate movement gains ground, the forces of fossil capital have become increasingly aggressive at suppressing that progress. All of these tactics are the tried and true tools of capital when under threat from the masses. Whether it's the wielding of race to create a wedge between fellow laborers, or gender or national differences to muddy the waters of organizing. As the visionary Black Panther Fred Hampton explains,
and the reason that this class over here has never did anything to get this class off his back because they want to keep you to believing that I'm your enemy.
Capital has long used tactics of delay, division, downplay, and deflection to prevent powerful coalitions. coalitions that would directly impact the profit-making capabilities of these corporations and ultimately their very existence. It is in this confrontation that we can begin to see an inkling of why fossil fuel corporations are pulling out all the stops to continue polluting and extracting at ever-growing rates. It would be easy just to say that fossil fuel companies are evil, but behind these multinational behemoths are the driving forces of capitalism. These multinationals are technically doing the right thing under a capitalist mode of production. Under capitalism, the driving force of production is not the preservation of the environment or a good life for all humanity. It is instead the accumulation of capital and expansion of profit. The whims of capital, ever following the cycle of money invested into commodity production, which exploits labor and the environment to obtain even more money, lack any form of incentive to shore up the gaping wounds of climate change and species extinction. Very simplistically, under capitalism, the survival of any corporation relies on that money, commodity, more money cycle. If laborers strike or push for better environmental standards that immediately jeopardize that cycle, it means that the money poured into commodity production could be more than the money that commodity can be sold for. In short, the company would be operating at a loss and would go under. This is why we are witnessing a dense web of actors spreading out to change the narrative around climate change. The economic forces of capitalist fossil fuel production press heavily on our social, cultural, and political infrastructure to ensure that the cycle of accumulation continues untroubled. This interplay between the forces of economic production and the broader societal structure that sits on top of it is known as the base and the superstructure, a concept in Marxism that has undergone intense debate but is summed up simply and skillfully in a video from Marxist YouTuber Prolacult.
The economic base of society consists of the economic structure of society, that is, the relations of production at any given stage of history, considered in their totality, upon which grows or arises an ideological superstructure. This superstructure encompasses ostensibly all ideological forms, including politics, law, art, religion, and philosophy.
In essence, the way we produce influences and shapes the social and political spheres around us, and those spheres in turn influence our economic production. We saw this in the laws enacted to criminalize protests to protect continued fossil fuel production, or with fossil capitalists spending over $125 million every year in just the US alone to influence politicians. The interplay between the base and the superstructure reveals itself in the corporate obstructionism that pours out not just from multinational fossil fuel companies, but also from a diverse range of climate denial agents backed by them. Ones that act as shields, or in some cases hammers, to block any movements attempting to dismantle the fossil fuel industry. In short, our economic reliance on fossil fuel extraction has shaped our political, cultural, and legal realms. This looks like the 1990s organization called the
Global Climate Coalition consisted of every major manufacturing trade association that produced or consumed fossil fuels, and every major company that was in the fossil fuels industry.
This group directly funded academics, writers, and spokespeople as a means to influence the narrative around climate change, and ultimately protect the continued extraction of fuel. As the former executive director of Greenpeace explains in an interview with Frontline,
the Global Climate Coalition is seeding doubt everywhere, sort of fogging the air with these counter arguments that are contradictory and nonsensical, running this propaganda across the country, putting millions of dollars into this media effort.
This effort continues to pervade schools across the United States in the form of curriculum indoctrination, sponsoring research, and blocking divestment campaigns. The hand of fossil capital also lies heavy on the political landscapes of many nations. The recent climate infrastructure bill was predicated on the whims of Joe Manchin, a man who's taken hundreds of thousands of dollars in oil money and whom one fossil fuel lobbyist says,
"Talk to his office every week. He is the kingmaker
And in Europe, we're seeing a surge of lobbying efforts from 13 different natural gas companies to erode European climate policy and expand natural gas infrastructure. While in several countries in Africa, like Nigeria and Mozambique, InfluenceMap found that those same fossil fuel companies are advocating for extensive liquid natural gas infrastructure under the guise of development. And while these multinationals weaken climate policies through lobbying and funding, they turn around and coat the airwaves with PR and media blitzes. The New York Times recently sold an ad spot to ExxonMobil on the Ezra Klein Show, touting their clean energy solutions.
We're working on solutions in our own operations.
Like carbon capture.
And clean energy from hydrogen.
So, who are we?
Believe it or not, ExxonMobil.
In a similar vein, Chevron boasts,
we're developing and deploying carbon capture and storage to lower our carbon intensity.
And these fossil fuel corporations also work hard to ingrain the narrative that oil and gas are more consistent forms of energy that foster freedom.
TotalEnergies is developing oil and natural gas in South Africa for energy that's more reliable and more accessible.
All of these nodes act to build an ideology that protects fossil fuel production. Narratives that tie masculinity to burning coal, as I talked about in this video, or connect freedom to oil. The incessant mouthpieces of fossil capital have invaded the very way we view the world, to the point that it's hard to imagine a world without cars, without natural gas, and without the continued production of fossil fuels. This is the base and the superstructure laid bare. A back and forth relationship with one pushing the other and the other pushing back. This means that it's not enough to just tamp down on climate misinformation or stop fossil fuel propaganda. Fossil fuel ideology will just find another way to slow down and stop climate action. The head of the fossil fuel hydra will continue to multiply. So to truly address and tackle climate change, we need to attack fossil capital at its base. At the site of production, it tries so hard to protect. Through the lens of the base and the superstructure, we can see that it's not enough to just change minds with science or advocacy. We need to change the very way our economy functions if we want a zero carbon and just world. This means full worker control of all points of production. A true democratically run economy where the decisions of what gets produced and how it gets produced don't lie in the hands of those on the board or in an executive suite, but instead with those working the assembly line and real everyday people. A true anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-ableist coalition that builds solidarity and power across all identities. But there's a long road between that vision and our reality, one that doesn't exactly line up with the urgency of the climate crisis. So mass pressure from below needs to gain climate justice wins right now that build towards the eventual dismantling of capitalism. This looks like non-reformist reforms like shutting down coal and natural gas plants or defunding the police. It looks like building climate-oriented and leftist union power among utility and electrical workers. It looks like organizing locally within your communities to blockade and sabotage fossil fuel extraction while building renewable power through climate-forward policy. But all of these approaches will run headlong into the immense apparatus of corporate power and denial, which means that as much as we will need to transform our economy, we also need to continue calling out the insidious forms of corporate climate denial like the good people at Drilled or DeSmog have been doing for years. In short, no one tactic will bring us towards a post-capitalist carbon-free future. We need to dismantle fossil capital's web of power on all fronts, from its economic base of oil and gas production to its media mouthpieces and political puppets. Because right now, the fossil fuel industry is making record profits and continues to build up and lock in more oil and gas production through extensive infrastructure projects. This is a dangerous path, which is why I've made a whole nother bonus video all about what's actually hidden behind all of these fossil fuel denial tactics we just learned about. That video is available right now exclusively on the creator-owned streaming service Nebula. On Nebula, you can watch over 25 bonus and extended art-changing climate videos like this one on how we can take effective climate action right now, or this hour and 20-minute long interview with the authors of Half-Earth Socialism. And when you're done watching OCC videos, Nebula is home to over 100 other creators producing high-quality, ad-free, and exclusive content. with originals like Real Life Lore's series War Room, which recaps and explains major geopolitical developments every single month, or my guilty pleasure Jet Lag, which is a travel game show where players use trains, cars, and even bikes to play tag, hide and seek, or even tic-tac-toe across the world. Nebula is quickly becoming the most interesting, fastest growing, independent video platform on the internet. That's in part because Nebula invests in us as creators. Part of your Nebula subscription goes directly to me when you use the link below, and part of it goes to producing Nebula original series, documentaries, or even plays, all of which take video creation to the next level. And the experience of watching all of this wonderful media is streamlined and easy to use. Algorithms, clickbait, and ads? None of that. Because Nebula is trying to redefine video streaming not just for creators, but also for viewers. Nebula is quickly becoming the answer to the question, how do you make art and content as high quality and as interesting as traditional media without the corruption and exploitation associated with that industry? So if you want to join a platform that's pushing entertainment forward, enabling us to make things we would have never been able to before, allowing us more say in what we produce, and getting rid of those pesky ads, all while getting access to exclusive high-quality videos from hundreds of creators like Climate Town, Simon Clark, Not Just Bikes, Johnny Harris, and countless other storytellers, you should join Nebula today. You can become a Nebula member by going to my link at go.nebula.tv/OCC, which you can find in the description. And there are options for monthly, yearly, and even lifetime membership. That's right, Nebula is now offering lifetime memberships that will last for as long as you and Nebula both exist. You pay $300 and get access to Nebula forever. But if that's not your speed, when you use my link, you can get 40% off the annual plan. The key is to use my special link. Only when you use it do you directly support me, and in the process get all my videos a month early and gain access to all the wonderful ad-free bonus content on Nebula for just $2.50 a month. So again, if you want to help support a wonderful group of creators redefine online video, you can sign up with my link at go.nebula.tv/OCC.